February 1943, North Atlantic. The sea was quiet. Too quiet. Convoy ONS-5 crawled through the dark, 60 merchant ships carrying food, fuel, and freedom across a killing ground no one yet controlled. Then just before midnight the first flare went up. Out of the black water rose the shapes of U-boats. 10, 20, maybe more, cutting the ocean with their wakes like wolves closing in for the kill. For 3 years, Germany had ruled this sea. The Atlantic was theirs, or so they believed. But that night the hunters didn't know that radar was now watching from the skies, and that a new kind of warship was coming for them. Before the dawn of 1943 was over, the Battle of the Atlantic and the fate of World War II would change forever. The war in Europe was decided not on land, but on water. Every bullet, every tank, every mouth in Britain and the Soviet Union depended on the convoys that crossed the Atlantic. But between America's ports and Britain's harbors stretched a deadly expanse. 3,000 miles of open ocean where no help could reach and no aircraft could fly. Sailors called it the Black Pit. The Germans called it our hunting ground. In 1940 and 1941, Hitler's U-boats had turned that hunting ground into a graveyard. Merchant ships burned across the horizon, their crews clinging to wreckage as the Atlantic swallowed them whole. Entire convoys vanished without a trace. The Royal Navy tried to fight back, but their escorts were too few, their technology too primitive. The sonar sets were unreliable and depth charges exploded blindly in the deep. The men aboard those convoys learned to live with fear, the kind that never slept. Every splash of water, every creak of metal sounded like a torpedo coming for them. By 1942, the situation was desperate. When the United States entered the war, its east coast became a new killing zone. German U-boats patrolled so close to American shores that sailors could see city lights on the horizon. They called it the Second Happy Time. Oil tankers burned off Cape Hatteras, lifeboats washed up on Florida beaches, and every week the losses mounted. In the single month of November 1942, German U-boats sank over 120 Allied ships, a devastating 600,000 tons of shipping. The Allies could not build new ships fast enough to replace the dead ones. But even as the Atlantic turned red, change was coming. Quiet, invisible, and relentless. In British labs and American shipyards, engineers were building new eyes and new ears for the sea. Radar that could see through fog and darkness. Sonar that could hear what no man could see. And on the decks of newly built escort carriers, small squadrons of aircraft were training to hunt beneath the clouds, to strike before the wolf packs could close in. For the first time, the ocean itself was about to fight back. And deep below the waves, the U-boat captains didn't yet know their reign was ending. By early 1943, the war in the Atlantic was balanced on a knife's edge. The Germans still had more than 200 U-boats roaming the seas. Sleek, silent predators guided by radio from hidden bunkers in occupied France. Their wolf packs stalked the convoys by night, surfacing to fire torpedoes before disappearing beneath the waves. Every attack was a game of nerves. The submarines hunted by sound, the escorts hunted by echo. The ocean listened to itself die. But in spring of that year something began to change. Something subtle, but unstoppable. Convoys that once sailed blind were now escorted by ships with new radar masts and improved sonar arrays. For the first time, destroyer captains could detect a U-boat before it struck. A faint ping on the screen, a shadow on the scope. And the hunter became the hunted. Across the Atlantic, the Allied command had learned a hard truth. The only way to protect convoys was to own the air above them. That's when the escort carriers arrived. Small, slow, and cramped, but armed with a weapon the U-boats couldn't hide from: aircraft. From the decks of these jeep carriers, Avengers and Wildcats patrolled the gray seas, flying low over the waves, their eyes scanning for the telltale slick of oil or the shimmer of a periscope. When one was found, the response was merciless. The aircraft would dive, depth charges tumbling into the sea, detonating with a violence that shook the sky. Below, pressure crushed steel, and men trapped in their submarines never resurfaced. Convoys that had once been helpless now struck back with precision and fury. By May 1943, the month U-boat crews would later call Black May, the hunters were dying faster than they could be replaced. In just 4 weeks, 41 German submarines were destroyed. Admiral Dönitz, the man who had once promised to starve Britain into surrender, was forced to pull his fleet from the Atlantic. For the first time since the war began, the sea was no longer a graveyard. It was a battlefield, and the Allies were winning. But even as the tide turned, the men aboard those convoys knew one thing: the ocean never forgets. The wolf packs might retreat, but they would return. And when they did, the Atlantic would test them all again. The U-boats that survived the slaughter of 1943 limped home in silence. Many returned half dead, their decks shredded, their crews hollow-eyed from exhaustion and fear. The men no longer believed they were hunters. They were prey, trapped in iron coffins that the ocean itself wanted to crush. Yet Berlin refused to surrender the sea. Admiral Dönitz demanded a new offensive, a desperate promise that the wolf packs would rise again. In the darkness of the North Atlantic, new models emerged from the pens at Lorient and Saint-Nazaire. The Type 1C and Type 7C boats, sleeker, deeper diving, with radar detectors mounted on their masts. But even these improvements couldn't hide the truth. The Allies were now fighting a different kind of war. Their ships could see farther, hear deeper, and strike faster than ever before. Every convoy now carried a full escort group, destroyers, corvettes, and frigates working as a single organism. At the heart of it, a floating command center tracked sonar readings, radio intercepts, and aircraft reports. The moment a submarine surfaced, a signal flashed across the fleet. Within minutes, the night sky filled with searchlights and tracers. The hunters' advantage was gone. Still, the Germans fought with terrifying courage. U-boat crews continued to launch attacks in the narrow gap between Greenland and Iceland, where cold storms and towering waves hid them from radar. Some even managed to sink destroyers before the Allied response arrived. Survivors described the sea as a graveyard of machines, steel corpses lying side by side beneath the waves. Yet what doomed the U-boats most wasn't courage or even technology. It was information. The Allies had cracked the Enigma code. Hidden in a bunker at Bletchley Park, mathematicians and linguists quietly read the German Navy's orders, routing convoys around the wolf packs before they even sailed. The U-boat captains never understood why their prey always vanished, why ambushes turned into traps. They only knew something had changed. The sea itself seemed to know their plans. By late 1943, their radio operators noticed a new terror: silence. No more long-range transmissions. No confident orders from command. Each submarine now fought alone, hunted across thousands of miles of ocean that no longer belonged to them. The wolf packs had become ghosts, haunting a sea that had already moved on. But far below the surface, in the cold dark where light never reached, one last generation of submariners still believed the tide could turn again. They waited for a miracle that would never come. By the winter of 1943, the Atlantic was no longer the domain of the U-boats. It belonged to the machines that could see without light and hear without sound. Radar swept the horizon. Sonar probed the deep. Every ripple of the sea, every faint echo was measured, plotted, and pursued. The Germans had once called their submariners the Grey Wolves. Now those same wolves found themselves running from invisible predators. Convoy escorts had evolved into disciplined hunting groups known as support forces. Their sole purpose was destruction. They didn't guard cargo ships anymore. They hunted submarines wherever they hid. Each group carried their own escort carrier, radar-equipped destroyers, and squadrons of aircraft that never slept. Day and night they patrolled the mid-Atlantic, dropping sonobuoys and depth charges with mathematical precision. When a sonar ping found its target, the attack unfolded like choreography. The destroyer turned hard, racing toward the contact at 30 knots. The crew held their breath as the sonar operator counted down the range. Then came the thundering roll of depth charges, great metal drums tumbling into the sea, detonating in a chain of underwater fire. The ocean boiled. If the first pass missed, a second ship followed, dropping hedgehogs, spiked bombs that exploded only on contact. Above, carrier aircraft circled, waiting for the U-boat to surface in panic. When it did, machine guns and rockets tore it apart before a single man could climb to the bridge. It was warfare reduced to science. Relentless, methodical, impersonal. But beneath the technology lay something more human. Revenge. Thousands of merchant sailors had died screaming in the water during the dark years of 1941 and 1942. Their brothers now hunted with a quiet fury, remembering every burning ship and every SOS that went unanswered. Each confirmed kill was more than victory. It was justice. The Germans tried to adapt. They added radar detectors, snorkels for underwater running, even acoustic torpedoes that chased propeller sounds. But nothing worked for long. The Allies countered each innovation within weeks. The U-boat war had become a race of invention, and Germany was running out of time, fuel, and faith. By the end of the year, U-boat losses had climbed so high that entire flotillas were wiped out before completing a single patrol. Young men fresh from training schools never lived to see the ocean's horizon. The wolf packs that once terrified the world now existed only as names scratched off on a wall in Dönitz's command room. And still, the Atlantic rolled on. Indifferent, endless, eternal. For the men who fought there, the sea offered no glory, only survival. But far to the east, in German shipyards, engineers were building something new. A weapon meant to change everything, and when it arrived, it would terrify even the victors. Even as the Atlantic slipped from their grasp, Germany refused to believe the war beneath the waves was lost. In secret shipyards along the Baltic coast, a new kind of submarine was taking shape. One so advanced it promised to rewrite the laws of naval warfare. The engineers called it the Type 21. To the men who saw its blueprints, it looked less like a submarine and more like a prophecy. Unlike the old U-boats that spent most of their time on the surface, the Type 21 was built to live underwater. It could dive deeper, stay submerged for days, and move silently through the black with electric motors that left no trace. Its streamlined hull could reach 17 knots below the surface, faster than any destroyer could track. Its sonar array could detect enemies miles away, and its torpedoes could be fired in rapid salvos from an automated reload system. For the first time, the ocean itself seemed to bow to human design. But in 1944, technology alone could not save a dying empire. The Allies were bombing German shipyards day and night. Many of the new submarines were destroyed before they ever touched water. Others were rushed into combat with untrained crews and unfinished systems. Of the hundreds planned, only a handful ever left port, and none changed the war. Still, for the U-boat men who survived long enough to see one, the Type 21 represented something more than machinery. It was the last symbol of a dream, a belief that Germany could still command the seas, that the tide could somehow be reversed. But dreams were fragile things in 1944. The Atlantic had already chosen its master. As Allied convoys crossed unchallenged from New York to Liverpool, supply lines grew fat with tanks, aircraft, and soldiers. Each safe crossing tightened the noose around Hitler's Europe. The same convoys that once bled the Allies. Dry were now feeding an unstoppable machine, one that would soon land in Normandy and begin the end of the Reich. By the time the first operational Type 21 finally sailed, the war was already lost. Allied destroyers prowled every route, aircraft ruled the skies, and radar painted the ocean with light. One German officer would later admit, "We built the submarine of the future for a war that no longer existed." In May 1945, as Germany surrendered, dozens of these sleek, half-finished submarines were scuttled by their own crews, sinking silently into the Baltic mud. The age of the U-boat had ended not with victory, but with silence. Yet the Allies knew what they had seen, and they would not forget it. The technology buried in those wrecks would soon shape a new era, the Cold War's undersea arms race, where shadows beneath the ocean would again decide the fate of nations. By mid-1944, the Atlantic was no longer a battleground. It was a highway. Convoys stretched from horizon to horizon, an unbroken chain of steel carrying the lifeblood of war. From New York to Liverpool, Halifax to Glasgow, Liberty ships steamed in formation, their decks stacked with fuel drums, jeeps, and crates stamped to Europe. Above them flew aircraft from escort carriers, cutting long shadows across the gray sea. Below them, sonar pulses echoed through the depths, searching for enemies that rarely came. For the men who had survived the worst years, the silence felt unnatural. They remembered the days when torpedoes sliced through the dark and flares turned the ocean to fire. Now there was only wind and water, and the low hum of engines bound for victory. Every safe crossing meant another city rebuilt, another army fed, another step closer to ending the nightmare. The U-boats still lurked, but they were broken ghosts of their former power. In 1944 alone, over 200 were lost. Few even made it to the convoy lanes. Allied radar blanketed the seas. Aircraft dropped sonobuoys that listened for the faintest whisper of a propeller. When contact came, the hunt was swift and merciless. No longer did convoys scatter in panic. They turned toward the threat, attacking as a pack of their own. The hunters had truly become the hunted. For the sailors aboard those destroyers, the victory was deeply personal. Many had lost friends in the early years. Men dragged into freezing water or burned alive in oil slicks. Now, every depth charge that detonated in the deep felt like redemption. They didn't cheer when a U-boat broke the surface. They watched silently as the sea swallowed it again. It was not joy they felt, but closure. By the time the Allies stormed Normandy in June 1944, the Atlantic lifeline was secure. In the words of one British admiral, "The Battle of the Atlantic has been won, and without it, nothing else would have been possible." The supplies that fueled D-Day, the men who liberated France, the tanks that broke through to Berlin, all of it had crossed a sea once ruled by fear. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the sailors who fought beneath the waves were among the last to be remembered. But their struggle had decided the war long before the beaches did. The Atlantic was not just a theater. It was the pulse of the free world. And when that pulse beat strong, tyranny began to die. But even in victory, the ocean kept its secrets. Thousands of ships still rest below, rusting quietly in the dark, their hulls overgrown with coral and silence. They are the forgotten soldiers of the deep, proof that freedom was not won on land alone, but in the endless, unforgiving sea. The victory over the U-boats was not won by courage alone. It was won by circuits, dials, and signals, by the quiet hum of machines that changed warfare forever. The Battle of the Atlantic had started as a duel of eyesight and luck, but it ended as a triumph of technology. Beneath the gray waves and above them, a new kind of war had been born, one fought with invisible weapons. The transformation began in laboratories and workshops far from the front. In Massachusetts, engineers at MIT's radiation laboratory refined microwave radar small enough to fit on aircraft. In Britain, scientists perfected the Lee light, a blinding spotlight that turned night into day during surprise attacks on surfaced submarines. Across Canada and the USD, factories worked around the clock to produce sonar sets, hedgehog mortars, and depth-charge fuses that could sense pressure, not just time. These were not glamorous inventions, but they decided the fate of nations. When an escort destroyer detected a faint echo miles below, the signal passed through vacuum tubes and oscilloscopes, an orchestra of electrons. Within seconds, bearings and ranges were plotted, coordinates shouted, and the ocean erupted. The enemy no longer had the advantage of invisibility. To the Germans, it was as if the sea itself had turned against them. Their vaunted wolf packs, the pride of Admiral Karl Donitz, could no longer coordinate attacks without being overheard by Allied radio intercepts. Enigma, once unbreakable, now betrayed its masters daily. At Bletchley Park, codebreakers read U-boat messages almost as fast as they were sent. Convoys adjusted course hours before the hunters even arrived. The Atlantic, once a hunting ground, had become a trap. Yet the true revolution was not in devices or decoding rooms. It was in mindset. The Allies had learned to think collectively, to merge human instinct with machine precision. A radar ping, a sonar pulse, a radio intercept, each fragment alone meant nothing. Together, They formed a living network of awareness that spanned thousands of miles. For the first time in history, technology had created an ocean-wide intelligence system, the embryo of what would one day become global surveillance, satellite navigation, and digital warfare. By 1945, no U-boat commander could cross the Atlantic unseen. Aircraft scoured the mid-ocean gaps once considered safe havens. Escort carriers launched round-the-clock patrols. Submarines that once slipped through the fog now fled from it, knowing radar waves could see through mist and night alike. The hunters who had once starved Britain now starved themselves. For fuel, for targets, for hope. In their last transmissions, many German captains sent the same message. The sea belongs to them now. They were right. The Atlantic had changed sides, not just in the balance of power, but in the nature of war itself. The ocean had become transparent, and in that transparency, the future of modern warfare, guided, networked, invisible, had begun. By the summer of 1943, the Atlantic was no longer a graveyard. The convoys that once crept through black water now sailed beneath the watch of escort carriers and long-range patrols. Radar scanned the horizon. Sonar traced every echo beneath the waves. For the first time since the war began, the hunters had become the hunted. German captains who once stalked merchantmen now spoke of a silent terror in the deep. Destroyers that appeared out of fog, aircraft that struck without warning, depth charges that rained like thunder. One by one, the wolf packs broke apart. The Atlantic, once ruled by steel and fear, began to breathe again. But the cost had been terrible. More than 36,000 Allied sailors never came home. Their ships still lie there, scattered from Newfoundland to the Irish Sea, resting beneath cold currents that carry no flags. Every convoy victory was written in salt and smoke, proof that freedom was never free. When the war finally ended, the Battle of the Atlantic had lasted almost 6 years. The longest, hardest campaign of them all, and yet because of it, the Allies could feed Britain, arm Europe, and carry the war back to the shores of tyranny. The ocean that had swallowed so many had, in the end, delivered victory. Today, merchant routes cross those same waters without fear. But when the fog rolls low over the North Atlantic, some still say you can hear the distant hum of engines, the echo of ships that once fought to keep the sea alive. Because after 1943, the U-boats never ruled again. And if this story moved you, subscribe and join us as we uncover more forgotten moments that changed the tides of history. Between 1939 and 1945, more than 3,500 merchant ships and 175 warships were lost to the Atlantic. But in that same ocean, nearly 800 U-boats were sunk, their steel hulls now resting on the seabed like tombstones of an empire's fading dream. Every rusting deck plate tells a story of men who fought invisible enemies, of convoys that refused to turn back, and of a world that learned the sea could fight for freedom too. The Battle of the Atlantic wasn't just a war for supply lines. It was a war for survival itself. And the men who sailed it made sure tyranny would never again rule the waves.